So it's think slow, act fast. And the problem is that most projects do the opposite. They think fast and then they get into problems, and then they are forced to act slow because all the problems they overlooked when they were thinking fast, are not going to disappear just because you overlooked them or glossed over them. So they will reappear during a delivery and slow down the project. So think slow means really considering what it is that you're doing. And there's a whole lot of elements that go into thinking slow. The first thing, which we emphasize as the most basic question that you have to ask when you do a project, is why are we doing this project? Why are we doing this project? That's what everybody should start with. And it sounds, so simple and commonsensical. But one of the things we find with the project delivery and project planning is that they actually, common sense is not that common. Let's put it that way, And this is one of the commonsensical things, like ask why you're doing the project before you start the project, that is routinely overlooked and gets people in all sorts of problems. So that's part of thinking slow. Another part of thinking slow is what we call think from right to left. So once you've answered the question, why, that gives you what goes in the box on the right on the process diagram that people usually, draw for projects. So you know what you're going to end up with. But then you need to work backwards from that all the way to the left, to where you start the project and figure out what are all the steps that we need to take in order to reach the end of the diagram on the right. That's what we call think from right to left. And that's also part of thinking slow, to have that all hammered out before you start doing your project. And there are different other things, so we can get to that. These are the two main things. So ask why, think from right to left.
Great. And Dan, I guess to build on what Bent just mentioned in terms of that asking the why and that pre-planning, in the book you mentioned some great examples, one being the Chinese sort of mass railway as an example of, again, what do you blame, the delivery part, or is it the forecasting or planning? Is there, can you maybe provide some examples in terms of where this in practice is really, you focus on it so nicely in the book?
Yeah. So, and by the way, I should add that think slow is also a deliberate nod towards Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, because, of course, he was emphasizing that thinking slow is conscious analytical thought versus intuitive thought. And what we know from Kahneman's work and all of modern psychology, and it's an incredibly important piece here, is precisely that the idea of rapidly grasping the situation, believing that you understand the situation, that there's nothing more to learn, and therefore making the initial decisions, that's natural human decision making, and so you can rush ahead. And when you combine that with the fact that in business there's constant pressure to show us some progress, get the shovels in the ground, get going, you combine those two factors, and that's why you so often have people thinking fast and then ultimately acting slow. And as an example of this, I'm a bit of a history nut. You may grasp by some of the exhibits in the background. One of the examples of this that I absolutely adore is the origins of the Pentagon, which is one of the most famous buildings. And you say to yourself, why does the Pentagon have 5 sides? And it turns out the Pentagon has 5 sides because at the time that they were looking for a place to put this building, which was very desperately needed because the United States was in a national emergency, there was this plot of land that was bounded by 5 roads, and it formed this sort of ugly, misshapen pentagon. And so the person who was in charge of the project said, right, that's it, put it there. And they started planning to do this. And then eventually other folks got a look at the project and they said, hey, do you realize that you're going to completely ruin the vista from Arlington National Cemetery overlooking Washington, which is one of the great national monuments in the United States? And what's more, they didn't just say there was a problem. They said, here's the solution. There's another piece of land just a little bit further down. Well, what was fascinating was that the person who was in charge of the project, the general who was in charge of that project, dug in his heels and absolutely refused. He had already committed. He was going to go ahead with that. And it ended up being a big fight. And fortunately, eventually, the president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, intervened and he said, actually, move it a little south, use that land. They moved it south, and that gave them enough room that they could take that misshapen Pentagon and they could even up the sides. And that's how you get the modern Pentagon.